considering people often say that English Tories are much worse than Scottish Tories, that actually the Scottish delegation of the Conservative Party in Westminster in Holyrood is likely to vote against this much more so as a percentage than their English opposite numbers. I wonder if that's also a bit of a political problem for her.
Well, how much do you think she still has the backing of her party? That's the first being brutally political, as Duncan said. Do you think if you think she's got the full backing of her party still, then that shouldn't be a problem for her? If she doesn't, then it will.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose electorally, I don't know if either of you saw, but Ewan McComb had a column on Think Scotland this week suggesting that while politically equal marriage may not be a particularly salient issue for voters, it's not likely to move most voters' attitudes one way or the other. If you come out against it very strongly and with a particularly sort of spicy kind of rhetoric, that actually that is going to be damaging for you. That it matters more if you come out against it in poor style. And I think it's quite likely that the Scottish Tories will do that. And his argument is that there's no votes in that direction. Just from brutal calculation, there's no votes for Ruth Davidson, who ought to be coming across as a much kind of younger and vital and more engaging and exciting politician than she is. I think he described them as the party's biddies and sort of people who are objectively pro-evil.
Well, I can't come out and be the controversial one in that case then, because I'm totally for the equalisation of everything. It's one of these things I think should have been done long ago, both here and in the United Kingdom, and that goes as far as, adoptions and everything else. After the, adoptions from gay couples and things as well, I don't see the problem. So I can't make the controversial figure that you're hoping.
Isn't that interesting though? The biggest reaction that I've seen from folk who aren't particularly, who aren't the sort of obsessives that we maybe are, is basically what I thought that already happened. There's the lack of interest in some ways is on the basis that people assumed it was already fixed. Ewan's absolutely right in terms of there's no particular votes to be won. There's only votes to be lost in this.
Which might be why they don't want to touch it.
Yeah. What do you think about this? I mean, Gordon Wilson's been banging on and on about how, speaking on behalf of the plain people of Scotland as he does, that if this bill is enacted, then independence is in a single swoop defeated. I think that's absurd, actually, as a proposition. I wonder, what do you think, Duncan, about the potential impact of this whole debate, if any, frankly, on the independence referendum, as you said, coming up in 2014?
Well, I think there's some fascinating little nuances. First of all, if Gordon Wilson is to be listened to, which is something I would question, but if he is, then the point he's making is an electoral one. He's essentially saying that you're not taking the people with you. And it contrasts quite sharply with the electoral point that the SNP mainstream has been pushing for a while for the independence question in general, which is essentially vote yes to get rid of the Tories on the basis of a lack of mandate or historical election results. Now, I'm not a huge fan of that argument because I don't think you make constitutional changes in order to win elections. But Gordon Wilson's point is essentially the same. He's taking it back to an inherent conservatism that he sees in the Scottish electorate, which obviously is there in parts. And you could argue, therefore, that perhaps the Western Isles or other parts of Scotland where the Free Church reigns supreme should be looking at independence from the rest of Scotland. Because it's basically the same argument. If you're going to argue on the basis of an electorate, then that's the same thing. Wherever we differ, we must draw a line. But the other one, which I think is fascinating, is in terms of the broader impact on independence, is the attitude of the SNP MPs to the Westminster bill. Now, they, quite interestingly, abstained from the UK bill. And they said that was on the basis that it didn't affect Scots law. Well, of course, it does affect Scots law, and handily, all Westminster bills have to say whether they affect Scots law, and it was set out that it did in about 3 different sections. But setting that aside, I think it's not too cynical to suggest that the reason they didn't vote on that second reading was that they couldn't be unanimous. The fact is that Angus MacNeil couldn't have voted in favour of it because the MP for the Western Isles simply can't do that and hope to win the next election.
Do they abstain from all the other votes that they say don't affect Scots law? I don't know. Maybe Andrew would know that.
My understanding is that they do. I think the argument about here is that actually there were substantial sections which did affect Scots law in terms of international private law, which sounds very dreary, and I must admit I've never studied it in detail, but is fundamentally about things like succession. Sorry, Duncan.
Where I was going with that is, and it's something that Jane Carnell, who tweets as Edinburgh, has blogged about, is that if the SNP group of MPs in Westminster, if you follow that logic and say the reason they are abstaining when they could have voted is that they couldn't reach a consensus, then they are voting on the basis of whether or not they can win the next election, which means they're voting on the basis of losing the independence referendum.
Belt and braces, though. Belt and braces. You'd be a brave politician to assume the opposite. I mean, although I must admit, Eck is always pointing and laughing when people suggest that the independence referendum will be won. So I suppose it's only fair to do it the other direction.
The other thing was Eric Joyce, just to complete that little bit of perhaps winding upness. Eric Joyce wrote a really fabulous and mildly offensive blog about why he was voting in favour of equal marriage. And when you read that, and this again is something that Jane said, when you read that, you're reading the words of a politician who literally doesn't care what happens in 2015 because he knows he's not getting reselected by anybody. He knows he's out of a job in 2015. And he actually says, I understand people don't like the idea of where people put their dangly bits and blah, blah, blah. And then he says, and I'm arguing from the point of view of love. And he makes a rather brutal but honest assessment of all the people who have written to him saying it's awful and says they're basically all unpleasant. Now, only politicians who don't care about the next election can say those things.
That was one of the times I quite enjoyed Gordon Brown when he called that woman a bigot, which she probably was. But the trouble was for him, he did it before the election.
Flashes of honesty are all very well, but not during an election.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe if I can just maybe push back a wee bit on that, Duncan, about the SNP and how they voted in terms of this. I mean, how do you feel about these sort of Scottish MPs of yours who voted against these kind of proposals? Because there is an argument that actually, yes, Pete Wishart was definitely wrong, that these will involve Scottish forces marriages, for example, that there are serious implications here for Scots law. But substantially, though, this is a measure which is about England and Wales. It is about marriage in England and Wales. I mean, that has been, I think, quite lost in terms of the debate and the reporting, which has talked about Britain. But actually, with your West Lothian hat on, does it not give you any sort of qualms to see, the sort of representatives from Ayrshire and the various other corners of Scotland voting against this bill for English and Welsh people?
No, not really. If it had been a vote that was within, 40 of losing, then we could maybe worry about it. I think the important thing that was done was the public saw an overwhelming majority in favour, and these things have to be given leadership and momentum like that. So, my view on the West Lothian question is, if we want to change the constitution, we should change the constitution. We shouldn't fudge within the current constitution. We have the setup we have. It's not. If one party decides to use it one way and another party decides to use it in another way, then that's up to them. But my view is we should solve the problem, not work around it.
Which is a classic British constitutional way of doing it, I suppose, muddling and fudging and working around. There was one funny thing about the debate, and maybe Michael, I know you've got a deep philosophical background, and one of the things which entertained and confuses me about this debate, and you saw it quite a lot in the House of Commons, is this argument from definition, this idea that marriage is between a man and a woman only. And you think, well, let's unpack that a wee bit. Let's try and dig in and find out where the authority for that proposition comes from. And I'm continually sort of surprised at how how many contemporary Platonists we have in our House of Commons who sort of think that there's knowledge out there in the sky which is unvarying, and if you're a true philosopher king, you can have access to it. Isn't that quite strange?
In this day and age where, sort of sometimes we hope against hope that we live, I'm quoting Douglas Adams there, and we hope against hope that we live in a more rational society sometimes. Surely in part it comes from the kind of religious connotations of the Bible. Although interestingly, I tend to collect good photos of good, placards at protests, and a guy had what the Bible says about gay people, and then between inverted commas there was literally nothing. Which I thought was quite good as well. The underpinnings of it come from tradition, but in these matters we all tend to support the traditions we like, and we tend to, it's like with a conscience vote, we tend to say, oh, it was a conscience vote and it went my way, oh, society's good. And then if it's a conscience vote that goes against what you want, you think, oh, society's so terribly bad. It's a religious hangover, I suppose. I don't know, what do you make of it, Andrew?
I think it's very strange and very against the grain of contemporary thought that tends to emphasize how contingent things are. I mean, you referenced there about what the Bible says about homosexuality, and actually it's one of these, I think, sexology and the emergence of sexualities and their sort of solidification into the present forms we understand them are actually a wonderful example of how contingent thought is, and actually that there was no such thing as a gay person before a particular point in time, because literally those aren't concepts which existed to think with. I mean, I'm sure there was sort of same-sex attraction and activity, but it's not. These are kind of contemporary concepts, and I think one of the really interesting things is that the defence of marriage, as it was seen by various Conservative MPs, is articulated in this kind of way that there's sort of an essential form of marriage, which is by definition between men and women. And actually, interestingly, I think if you can see the same thing going on more conservative accounts of sexuality on the other side, that you are sort of that homosexuality, being gay, is something essential to you, that you're born a particular way, and that there's a kind of meeting between the concept and your experience of life. There's been gay people throughout all of history. That kind of argument is actually quite similar to the argument about marriage. I don't know if that potentially is a bit obscure, but I think it's interesting to see how, and this maybe touches on a fact that the whole equal marriage argument is actually quite conservative in terms of its claims and its goals. Well, one might think.
In this case, they wouldn't say that the gay marriage was a tradition. They'd say homosexuality was something that's existed all the time. Perhaps not tradition is the wrong word, but
Duncan, I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think there's the sort of conservative strain which runs through the sort of same-sex marriage argument, which sort of one person described it as an exaltation of coupledom, if you like, and just an extension of this idea that there's one sort of true love for us all, and all this sort of reference to loving couples. That's actually quite a conservative proposition, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, essentially, to me, it goes back to it's an equality versus liberation argument. We've, long, in terms of the gay community, there's long been a split between people who perceive, the success of the equal rights movement, the success of the gay rights movement as being equality. And there are people who see the success of the gay rights movement as being liberation from the constraints of equality, if you like. Mm-hmm. And I think that's run for a long time, and I think it will continue to run. I mean, it's almost, one needs to admit that just as when we were campaigning for civil partnerships, we said, no, of course, equal marriage isn't the next step. Now that we're campaigning for equal marriage, no, of course, liberating all relationships into a free-for-all of horrific proportions isn't the next step at all. We're not heading for a bacchanalian future in any sense. But
Drad.
Watch this space in 10 years. You're right. I mean, it is. You can frame it very easily as a conservative approach, and I think that's been Cameron's success. It's exactly what he did to push equal marriage. He said, "I'm voting in favour of it, not despite the fact that I'm a conservative, but because."
Maybe I could just pick up something you said a wee bit back there, Duncan, which I thought was interesting, was about conservatism in Scotland. with a small c perhaps, as opposed to with a big C. And maybe do we underestimate the extent of this sort of mode of thought? And this is just an issue which I've been considering recently in the context of this, but also in the context of the kind of pro-independence message. I have sort of socialist lefty pals who are saying that